The street looked ordinary from the outside. Neatly lined houses with trimmed hedges, pale curtains drawn halfway, and children's bicycles left on front lawns gave the small town its picture-perfect charm. Yet in the middle of that quiet row sat a house that people rarely lingered near. Its bricks were darker than the others. Its paint chipped more quickly, and even the grass seemed unwilling to grow too close to its foundation. Nobody ever said it out loud at first, but neighbors had long noticed that whenever a family moved into that house, their pets didn't last. Dogs would stop barking one night and never return. Cats that once curled up in sunny windows simply vanished. The excuses were always the same: an open gate, a runaway, maybe coyotes from the woods. But after a while, people began whispering among themselves. They said the house had a hunger. It didn't start with people. It started with animals. The year was 1998, late summer, in a town that didn't often make the news. It was the kind of place where the sound of lawnmowers filled Sunday mornings, and everyone knew the mailman by name. On the surface, life seemed easy. Kids rode their bikes to the gas station for soda, couples grilled in their backyards, and the church bells rang every evening at 6. But if you listened closely, you could hear the tension in the silence that surrounded that one house. Parents pulled their children away from the gate when walking to school. Teenagers dared each other to step onto its porch, but it never lasted more than a few seconds. Something about it felt off, though nobody could explain why. The family who lived there that year seemed normal enough. A mother who smiled politely but never spoke much. A father who worked long hours and rarely appeared at block parties. A boy, 12 years old, skinny with dark hair and restless eyes. And a girl, younger, who always carried a doll with a missing arm. They didn't stand out except for the way they stayed apart, as if a thin veil separated them from the rest of the street. People tried to welcome them, but conversations ended quickly. It was as though the house itself didn't allow warmth to linger inside its walls. At first, the family's golden retriever was what drew the most attention. He was full of life, bounding up and down the front yard with a tennis ball in his mouth. Neighbors often smiled when they saw him, a bright spot that seemed to challenge the gloom of the house. But one evening, just weeks after they had moved in, the dog's bark went silent. The boy searched up and down the street, calling his name until his voice cracked, but the dog never came back. The mother explained it away. Maybe he slipped out the gate, maybe he was hit by a car, and no one had found him yet. But inside the town's coffee shop, whispers began again. The missing animals stretched back years. A beagle, a parrot, even a tank of fish that reportedly went cloudy overnight. Some people said it was a coincidence. Others said it was a curse. Children made up stories about the house's basement swallowing pets whole. None of it had proof, but the unease grew with every disappearance. The boy took the loss hardest. His father brushed it off, saying it was just a dog and that he needed to toughen up. But the boy grew quieter after that, spending more time staring at the floor, less time laughing. The girl carried her broken doll everywhere, whispering to it like she was sharing secrets no one else could hear. And the mother, who once smiled politely at neighbors, stopped opening the curtains at all. Still, on the outside, everything looked ordinary enough. Bills were paid. The children went to school. Groceries were carried in on Saturday mornings. It was easy for outsiders to think the family was fine, but those who watched closely noticed the cracks. The father's temper rose quickly, even over small things, his voice sharp behind thin walls. The mother's shoulders curved in as if she were bracing against something invisible. The boy flinched when spoken to too loudly, and the girl never seemed to stop holding that doll. The house itself seemed to absorb it all, the tension, the silence, the broken bits of their lives. Every window reflected shadows a second too long. Every door creaked as if it were sighing under the weight of secrets. It was not a place that gave comfort. It was a place that waited. The town, for all its gossip, tried to carry on as usual. But under the surface of everyday life, church gatherings, soccer games, school plays, there was an unspoken rule. Don't get too close to that house. Neighbors warned babysitters not to accept jobs there. Kids crossed the street rather than walk past. And though no one admitted it, Many prayed for the day the family would leave, just as others had before them. But leaving never solved anything, because the house always remained, waiting for the next set of pets and the next set of lies it would begin to pull apart. The story of what really happened inside those walls would take years to unfold. But even in those early days, you could feel it, that slow, heavy sense that something was wrong. A family trying to appear normal, a neighborhood pretending nothing was strange, and a house that seemed to breathe when no one was looking. It had already taken so much, starting small, testing limits. And in time, it would not be satisfied with animals alone. The weeks after the dog disappeared brought a change inside the house that outsiders couldn't see, but the walls carried it like a stain. The boy stopped running through the yard, and his shoes stayed cleaner because he no longer scuffed them in the grass. He sat at the kitchen table in silence, doodling circles on paper while his father's voice filled the room with impatience. The father had never been a kind man, but now his temper seemed sharper, like the loss of the dog was an inconvenience he blamed everyone else for. He muttered about responsibility, about discipline, about how children needed to learn hard truths early. The mother stayed quiet during these rants, her eyes locked on the floor, her hands gripping her apron until her knuckles turned white. I could see wasn't just the silence that grew inside the house. It was the way the air felt heavier, as though arguments hung in it long after the voices had stopped. The girl, only 8 years old, began whispering to her doll more often, cradling it like it could protect her from things she couldn't put into words. Sometimes her whispers grew louder, almost as if she was answering questions no one else had asked. The boy noticed, but he said nothing. In that house, speaking about the strange things only made the father's anger worse. Money wasn't flowing the way the father wanted. He had moved the family to that town for a job that promised stability, but the hours were long and the pay wasn't what he expected. He blamed the mother for spending too much on food, blamed the children for needing new clothes for school, and blamed everyone but himself. His voice carried through thin walls at night, echoing over words like failure and useless. Neighbors pretended not to hear. The mother carried the weight quietly, but cracks began to show in her face. She looked tired even in the mornings, her eyes rimmed red as if she had. He slept it all. She lingered at the grocery store longer than needed, speaking softly with the cashier, not because she needed help, but because she needed someone to look at her like she still existed. There was a sadness in the way she carried the bags back home, a hesitation each time she walked up the path toward that house. Inside, the boy's relationship with his father twisted more tightly into knots. One night, when the boy left his homework half done on the table, the father snapped. His hand slammed down so hard the pencil broke in two. He told the boy he would never be a man if he couldn't focus. That weakness would ruin him just like it ruined others in the family. The boy didn't know what his father meant by that, but he felt the sting of shame bury itself deep in his chest. From then on, he carried an invisible fear that every mistake he made would somehow feed the house itself. The girl, meanwhile, grew stranger in her habits. She would place her doll on the windowsill facing outside, saying it was keeping watch. When the dog's food bowl still sat by the back door, untouched for weeks, she placed her doll beside it like she was giving the house something else to take instead. The mother scolded her for it, telling her not to play with food, but the girl just shrugged, muttering, "It doesn't like to wait." Nobody asked her what she meant. As months passed, the house began to take on its own rhythm. Lights flickered even when bulbs were new. Doors swayed open without a draft. At night, faint scratches sounded inside the walls, too faint to be rats, too rhythmic to be pipes. The boy heard them most often and once pressed his ear against the plaster. He swore he heard breathing, slow, patient, not human. He told his mother, but she hushed him quickly, saying it was only his imagination. Still, she checked the locks on every door that night, her hands shaking as she turned each key. External pressures only worsened the father's rage. His boss cut his hours, leaving bills tighter than ever. He took it out on the family, shouting at the mother for buying brand cereal instead of store brand, yanking the boy's backpack from his hands to inspect the books, and accusing the girl of breaking things she hadn't touched. The house became less a home and more a cage where everyone moved carefully, afraid to set off another explosion. The mother carried secrets of her own, though. Before the move, back in another town, there had been rumors about her. Whispers that she had tried to leave once before, years ago, only to be pulled back by her husband's promises and threats. She knew what it felt like to be trapped. Now, in this new house, her fear grew sharper. Each time she thought of leaving, the walls seemed to close in, reminding her of the dog that had vanished without a trace, reminding her that if even animals couldn't escape, what hope did she or her children have? The boy began withdrawing from schoolmates. Teachers noticed him staring out windows during lessons, his notebooks filled with drawings of empty houses, dark hallways, and staircases that led nowhere. He didn't speak of what went on at home, but it showed in the way he jumped when his name was called, or how he clenched his fists until his nails cut in to his skin. His silence made others uneasy. Friends stopped inviting him to play. Loneliness wrapped around him until the house itself seemed like his only companion, even as it frightened him. The girl's whispers turned into conversations. Sometimes, late at night, the boy heard her voice through the thin wall between their rooms. She wasn't just whispering to the doll anymore. She was answering something. Pauses stretched between her words, as if she were listening. Once, when he pressed his ear to the wall, he heard her giggle, soft and unsettling, followed by silence, so heavy it made him back away in fear. The father began drinking more heavily. Beer cans were collected in the trash, and bottles lined the counter. His mood swung wildly, one moment apologizing, the next throwing a chair against the wall. The mother tried to protect the children from the worst of it, but her protection was limited. She learned to usher them into their rooms, close their doors, and wait until the storm passed. But every storm left damage behind. The tension grew unbearable, and yet the family carried on their routines as if pretending could keep them safe. They went to church on Sundays, the mother dressing carefully to cover bruises. The boy carried his books like shields. The girl clutched her doll so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Outwardly, they were still a family. But behind closed doors, the house was feeding. Not just on pets anymore. It fed on fear, silence, and broken trust that belie winter. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The boy, once eager to please, began feeling a dark pull toward the house itself, as though the walls spoke to him in his sleep. The girl no longer whispered only at night. She spoke to her doll openly, sometimes answering questions no one else had asked. And the mother, tired, hopeless, began to look at her children with a haunted expression, as if she already knew they were all heading towards something they couldn't escape. The house had been patient. It had started small with pets, testing how much it could take before anyone fought back. Now it had worked its way inside the family itself. And with every passing day, every argument, every silence, the breaking point drew closer. The night it happened was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped through cracks in the windows and settled in the bones. Snow had started to fall, soft at first, then heavier, blanketing the neighborhood in silence. From the outside, the house looked almost peaceful under the fresh layer of white, a crooked kind of beauty against the glow of the street lamps. But inside it was suffocating. The walls felt too close, the air too heavy, every sound too sharp. Dinner had been tense. The father slammed his fork against the plate with each bite, muttering about wasted money and children who didn't respect him. The mother moved food around her plate without eating, her face pale, her eyes lowered. The boy pushed away his meal, his stomach in knots. The girl kept her doll propped in an empty chair beside her, feeding it small pieces of bread as if it were alive. No one laughed. No one dared. When the father reached for his drink and found the bottle nearly empty, something in him snapped. His voice rose, sharp enough to cut through the quiet, accusing the mother of hiding the rest, accusing the boy of lying, accusing the girl of staring at him with eyes that weren't hers. The boy tried to speak, to tell him it wasn't true, but the words died in his throat. The girl clutched her doll, whispering faster now, as though she were begging it to help. The fight erupted like a storm. Chairs scraped against the floor, plates clattered, the father's rage filling every corner of the house. The boy stood up, fists clenched, but he was too small to stop anything. The mother tried to calm him, her voice trembling, but the father shoved her back, the crack of her body against the wall echoing louder than thunder. The girl screamed, a high, piercing sound that froze the boy in place. Then came the moment when everything shifted. The boy grabbed the knife from the table. Not with a plan, not with thought, but out of raw, desperate instinct. His hand shook as he held it, his breath fast, his heart slamming in his chest. He shouted for his father to stop, his voice breaking, but the man only laughed, a cruel, low sound that made the air colder. He took a step forward, towering over the boy, eyes filled with anger and something darker, something almost inhuman. The mother tried to pull the boy back, her hands grabbing his shoulders, but the father reached for him first. The boy didn't think. He only reacted. The knife drove forward, slicing through the heavy silence, a wet sound that would haunt him forever. The father's face twisted, shock flashing across his features before it shifted into rage, and then something else, fear. He staggered back, clutching his side, blood spreading across his shirt like a shadow that wouldn't stop growing. For a second, no one moved. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Then everything came crashing down at once. The mother screamed, her voice raw and broken, rushing to the father as he collapsed against the table. The girl sobbed, still holding her doll, rocking back and forth like she could disappear inside the motion. The boy stood frozen, the knife slippery in his trembling hand, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He couldn't believe what he had done. He couldn't believe how quickly it had happened. The father gasped for air, his words jagged, torn by pain. He cursed the boy, cursed the house, cursed them all. His hand reached toward the mother, then fell limp, the light draining from his eyes as his body went still. The room went quiet again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the smell of blood and fear. The boy dropped the knife, the clang of metal against tile, making him flinch. His hands were stained red, his chest rising and falling so fast he thought he might faint. The mother knelt on the floor, shaking, pressing her hands against the wound as if she could stop the life spilling out, but it was useless. She knew it. She felt it. Her sobs filled the room, desperate and hopeless. The girl whispered to her doll through her tears, saying over and over, "I told you it doesn't like to wait. I told you." Her small voice carried an eerie calm undertone. Fear, as if some part of her had expected this, as if the house had whispered it to her long before the moment arrived. The aftermath came quickly, messy, panicked. The mother begged the boy to go upstairs, to wash his hands, and not to say a word. She tried to think, tried to find a way out, but her thoughts tangled like broken threads. The boy obeyed in a daze, scrubbing his hands raw under the bathroom faucet, but the red wouldn't leave. Even when the water ran clear, he swore he still saw it, clinging to his skin, seeping into his nails. Downstairs, the mother dragged the body toward the basement door, her strength fueled by terror. She whispered apologies under her breath, to him, to the children, to herself. She didn't know what else to do. She couldn't call anyone, not the police, not the neighbors. The house seemed to close in around her, urging her to keep the secret buried. The girl followed her silently, doll in hand, watching every move with wide, unblinking eyes. The boy returned, pale and shaking, just in time to see his father's legs disappear into the basement shadows. The mother closed the door quickly, her breathing harsh, her hands covered in blood. She told him not to ask questions, not to speak, not to think about it. But the boy couldn't stop thinking. He couldn't stop replaying the moment, the sound, the look on his father's face. He couldn't tell if the house had made him do it, or if something inside him had always been waiting for that night. The snow outside kept falling, covering the street, covering the world in white silence. Neighbors went about their evenings, unaware of the violence that had just torn through the house they already feared. But inside, the air was different now. The wall seemed to breathe slower, steadier, satisfied. The house had taken more than a pet this time. It had tasted blood, and it was never going to let that night be forgotten in the days after the crime. The house grew quieter than it had ever been. Not the peaceful kind of quiet but the thick, suffocating silence that comes after a scream. Every sound seemed louder. The creak of the stairs, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock. The boy noticed it most, lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling. He swore he could still hear his father's voice, not in words, but in the scrape of the wind against the windows, in the heavy thump of the pipes, in the stillness that pressed against his chest until he could hardly breathe. The mother tried to hold the family together. She scrubbed the floors until her hands bled, washed every dish twice, threw out the stained tablecloth, and opened every window to let the air clear. But no matter how hard she worked, the smell of blood seemed to linger. She told herself it was gone, buried in the basement with him, but in her mind she could still see it, spreading like a shadow across the tiles. She spoke less and less, avoiding the children's eyes, because every time she looked at them, she was reminded of what they had all lost, and what they had done to lose it. The girl carried on almost as if nothing had happened, though her behavior unsettled the others even more now. She talked to her doll constantly, louder than before, answering questions as though it truly spoke back. When her brother asked who she was talking to, she only smiled and said, "It knows everything now." She often sat near the basement door, humming softly, her doll cradled in her lap, as if she were keeping guard. The boy couldn't escape the guilt. He washed his hands until his skin cracked, but no matter how raw they became, he still saw the blood. He avoided mirrors because his own eyes frightened him. He swore they didn't look like his anymore. At school, teachers noticed his silence, how he no longer answered questions or joined in games. Friends gave up trying to include him. He drifted further into himself, convinced that everyone could somehow tell what he had done, that the secret was written across his face. The mother, terrified of discovery, built their life around denial. She told the children to never speak of that night again, not to anyone, not even to each other. When the neighbors asked where the father had gone, she said he had left them, that he couldn't handle the family anymore. People pitied her, whispered about what a cruel man he must have been to abandon his wife and children. She accepted the sympathy with a stiff smile, but inside, her heart twisted with shame. The community, though uneasy, had long expected something strange from that house. The father's sudden disappearance only added fuel to their suspicions. Rumors spread. Maybe he had another woman. Maybe he ran off with debts he couldn't pay. Maybe the house had finally taken him like it had the pets before. The police visited once after a coworker reported him missing, but the mother's story seemed to satisfy them. Men leave their families all the time. There was no reason, on paper, to think otherwise, but children notice things adults overlook. Some of the neighborhood kids said they saw the boy digging in the snow late one night. Others said the girl was always whispering near the basement door. Stories spread through the schoolyard, and soon everyone avoided the siblings. They became shadows at the edge of groups, the ones no one wanted to sit beside at lunch. Inside the house, life rotted slowly. The basement door was never opened again, at least not while the children were awake. But the boy sometimes woke at night to the sound of it creaking, soft footsteps below, and then silence. Once, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table at dawn, her face pale, her hands shaking, as though she had been up all night listening to. Neither of them spoke of it. The mother grew thinner, her cheeks hollow, her voice quiet as though it belonged to someone else. The girl only became stranger, her eyes too knowing for her age, her words carrying weight she shouldn't have understood. And the boy, caught between guilt and fear, carried the memory of that night, like a second skin he couldn't peel away. As weeks turned into months, the town stopped asking about the father. He was gone, and the family was left to fend for themselves. But pity turned to suspicion when small things began to surface. A neighbor swore she saw the mother carrying heavy bags out to the trash at odd hours. Another claimed they heard shouting late at night, voices that didn't sound like any of the family members. The old whispers about the house being cursed came back stronger, spreading through church pews and grocery aisles, until everyone spoke of it again as if it were alive. For the family, denial was the only way forward, but denial came at a cost. The boy's grades slipped, his teacher's warning that he seemed distracted, detached. The mother was called into school once, but she brushed it off, saying he was adjusting to his father's absence. She didn't realize the boy wasn't adjusting. He was unraveling. He replayed that night in his mind until it felt more like a dream than something real. Sometimes, in the middle of class, he could almost hear the sound of the knife again, could almost feel the weight of it in his hand. The girl, meanwhile, slipped further into her imaginary world. She stopped talking to classmates altogether, choosing instead to whisper to her doll, even during lessons. Teachers grew concerned, but the mother dismissed it, saying she was just shy. In truth, the girl's whispers were not shy. They were confident, steady, like she knew she was being listened to. The house, as if feeding on their silence, grew heavier. Visitors remarked on how cold it always felt, even in summer. Light bulbs burned out faster than anywhere else. The floorboards groaned at night when everyone was still. But to the family, the strangest part was the way the basement door seemed to breathe. On quiet nights, they swore they could hear something shifting behind it, as though the house itself was remembering. Guilt shaped each of them differently. The mother buried hers under constant work, scrubbing, cooking, forcing order on a place that rejected it. The boy drowned in his, slipping further away from friends and even his own reflection. The girl seemed untouched by guilt, as if she had given away to the doll or to the house itself, and in return gained something darker, something watchful. The community never learned the truth, not then. On the surface, the story was simple. A man abandoned his family, and they carried on without him. But those who walked past the house at night, those who heard the faint sounds drifting through its windows, whispered otherwise. They said no one who entered that house left unchanged. And for the family who lived inside, the truth was far worse. They weren't just living with the aftermath of a crime. They were living with the house itself, an entity that had always been patient, always been hungry, and now had blood to keep it satisfied. Years later, when people spoke about the house, their voices always lowered without meaning to. Time hadn't erased what had happened inside its walls. It had only made the silence heavier. The story of the family who lived there blurred into rumor and half-remembered gossip. But for those who had been close enough to see it, there was no forgetting. What had started with the loss of pets ended with a father buried in the basement, a family shattered, and a neighborhood forevermore, ked by the shadow of that place. The boy grew into a man, but he never grew past that night. Guilt clung to him like another skin. He carried it into every room he entered, every conversation he had, though no one else knew why. On paper, his father had been just another man who abandoned his family, a statistic that drew brief pity, but little more. No police officer ever uncovered the truth. No neighbor ever demanded answers. And so the secret lived only inside the boy's chest. But secrets like that rot the person who holds them. By the time he was in his 20s, his eyes already carried the hollow look of someone much older. He never spoke of the knife, of the blood, of the silence that followed. Yet everything he did, the way he avoided close friendships, the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way he looked at his own hands, betrayed the memory. The girl's life twisted in a different way. She held on to the house's whispers long after they left it. While her brother tried to bury the past, she carried it openly, though in ways most people dismissed as oddness. Teachers labeled her distant. Employers called her strange. She never let go of the doll, even as she grew, and she often muttered under her breath, as if still answering questions no one else could hear. For her, the crime wasn't just an act of violence. It was a covenant between the house and the family, one she seemed unwilling to break. Where her brother carried guilt, she carried belief, convinced that the house had always intended it to happen, that it had used them as instruments of something larger and darker. The mother faded with time. Her body survived the years, but her spirit did not. The guilt of silence, of dragging her husband's body into the basement, of watching her children unravel under the weight of what had happened, hollowed her out. Neighbors saw her as a quiet, fragile woman, a figure of pity who had been abandoned and left to raise 2 children alone. They never knew the truth, but they sensed the grief. She carried it like a shadow that never left her side. She died younger than most, her health eroded by stress, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she had allowed to happen, what she had helped conceal. Legally, justice never came. There was no trial, no police report that hinted at murder, no courtroom scene where truth was laid bare. The man's disappearance became another cold file, one that would gather dust in some small-town office. From the outside, he was simply gone, swallowed up by the statistics of men who leave and never return. But inside the family, justice was replaced by punishment of a different kind. The slow, unrelenting punishment of memory. The town never fully forgot, though its suspicions scattered across years. They spoke of the house as cursed, told their children not to go near it, and repeated the story of how every pet that entered its walls vanished. They were right, though not in the way they thought. What they didn't see, what they didn't want to see, was that the curse wasn't only in the house. It was in the people it held. The broader impact lingered in quiet ways. The story became a cautionary tale told in whispers about families breaking apart, about secrets festering in silence, about how violence can grow in ordinary places. Some people blamed the father's temper, others blamed the mother's silence, and others still blamed the house itself. But beneath the blame was something harder to face, the truth that violence often grows unnoticed, watered by fear and silence, until it finally consumes everything. The story raised questions that no one wanted to answer. What does justice mean when a boy kills his father, not out of hatred, but out of a desperate instinct to protect? What does morality mean when silence feels safer than truth? Was the mother guilty of her husband's death for not stopping it, or guilty of destroying her children's lives by hiding it? And what does it say about society that no one asked harder questions, that neighbors looked away, that the police accepted the simplest explanation? The house itself still stood long after the family left. Other families came and went, never staying long. Pets still disappeared. Lights still flickered. The reputation only grew darker until the house became less a home and more a warning. People said it consumed those who lived inside, and maybe it did. But the real horror was not the bricks or the walls. It was how easily violence can hide behind them, how quickly a family can crumble while the world outside pretends not to see. The story of the house and the family that once lived there is not just a ghost story, though that's how many tell it now. It's a story about power, how one man's temper ruled over his wife and children until fear became their daily language. It's a story about silence, how the mother's inability to speak out trapped them all in a cycle that ended in blood. And it's a story about morality, how lines blur when survival takes over, how children can become instruments of violence when pushed to the edge. Justice never came through courts or prisons. Instead, it came through the slow decay of lives marked forever by that night. The boy who never escaped his guilt. The girl who never let go of the whispers. The mother who wasted away under the weight of her silence. And the town that carried on, whispering about. The house, never daring to look too closely. In the end, the house did what it had always done. It swallowed lives piece by piece. First pets, then peace, then blood. But it also revealed something deeper, something that reaches beyond that one street in that one town. It showed how fragile families can be, how violence can grow quietly inside the most ordinary walls, and how easy it is for society to look away until it's too late. The story does not end with justice, because sometimes life doesn't offer that. It ends with reflection, with the reminder that silence can be as deadly as violence, that fear can shape lives as powerfully as love, and that houses, whether cursed or not, carry the weight of everything done inside them. Some say the house was hungry. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was only a mirror reflecting the darkness already inside the people who live there.